Okay, so we'll start first by looking at, very briefly, Spain, then a little bit more Portugal, and then we'll get into, as I said, a lot of the focus on our examination of the emergence of plantation slavery in the New World will focus on the British especially, and a little bit the Dutch and their role in sort of the slave trade. But before we get there, we'll look at how it emerged in specifically Spain, and the Spanish Empire in the Americas, and then eventually we'll find our way to England and the British Empire, and specifically the sort of what will become the American South. So firstly, as we sort of saw in the previous video, and also the video of Professor Jeffrey Pilcher, we talked a little bit about why there was sort of a move from native indigenous slavery to eventually would be African slavery. As we know, the Spanish initially relied on forced native and indigenous labor, but it proved sort of untenable for a number of reasons. Firstly, the demographic collapse that took place. If in the case of sort of slavery, specifically in the mines. This is before we get to plantation agriculture, but the slaves that were first brought to the Americas were mostly working in mines, some plantations that may have existed sort of along the northern coast of South America, what would be today Colombia and Venezuela. They were brought because there was two things: the demographic collapse, and also there was a growing movement in Spain, spearheaded by what you could arguably call the first human rights campaigner in history, a sort of Catholic priest named Bartolomé de las Casas. And Las Casas, basically, in traveling through the New World, was horrified by what he saw in the treatment of the indigenous people. But before we celebrate him too much, his solution to the problem of indigenous slavery was African slavery. And the reason he makes this distinction is because, from the Catholic Church's point of view, they saw indigenous people as new souls. If, conquistadors like Cortez were looking for money, a lot of sort of Catholic priests, Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans who were moving into the New World saw the potential to convert millions of people to the Catholic faith. And they saw slavery as potentially getting in the way of that. Right? You're not really going to convince people to join your faith if the people you also come with are enslaving everybody. So his solution was African slaves. Well, the question becomes, well, why was he okay with enslaving people from West Africa, but he wasn't okay with enslaving indigenous people? And part of that was because he saw the conversion of West Africans as a lost cause, that they were of the old world. So they weren't these pure new souls to be brought to the banner of Christ. They either practiced indigenous religions that existed along the African coast, or a lot of them also were of the Islamic faith. And so they didn't really feel that they could convert them. So slavery was okay. And at this point, to understand that slavery, even though in some cases was regarded as illegal, it was illegal to enslave Christians, which also became a problem. It was not illegal to enslave non-Christians. That's partly why you had a trade in slaves between the Venetians and the Islamic Empire. It was okay for the Islamic empires to take Christian slaves, and it was okay for the Christians to take Islamic slaves, so they kind of had a mutual understanding. And so this is sort of how it gets going in the case of Spain and Portugal. And Portugal, as we'll talk about a little bit later, was sort of the country that spearheaded the slave trade. As I said, when they were looking initially for spices, and then, of course, bringing sugar to Brazil, they were also looking for slaves, and they found them, of course, when they went along the African coast. Specifically, they established slave trading facilities in São Tomé off the coast of Angola. Now, if we look at British North America, it's a little bit different. Now, what emerges in British North America and why slavery emerges there is in some ways not accidental, but it wasn't certain. As I said earlier, it wasn't a sort of straight line to slavery. What you had before, when the English initially settled in the Chesapeake, which was modern-day Virginia and Maryland, was, as I said, tobacco was the principal crop. In fact, so many of the colonies that were established, specifically the first one in Jamestown, almost failed multiple times until John Rolfe discovered tobacco and decided that you could use this as a staple crop. And in 1619, 1620, the first African slaves started to arrive. But prior to that, African slavery in what would become the American South grew unevenly. Now, initially, what you saw was a system of indentured servitude. They were unable to enslave indigenous peoples for a couple of reasons. One, the population density was far less in North America, and also indigenous people moved into the interior and were able to avoid being captured and forced into slavery from Europeans. For the first couple of decades of English settlement in Virginia, the English were largely dependent on trade with indigenous people to survive. They would not have survived without the help of indigenous people, especially the Jamestown colony. But once they start figuring out how to grow tobacco, they've got a way to sustain itself by basically engaging in staple crop production. But initially, tobacco was maintained and farmed by indentured servants from Europe, white indentured servants from Europe. And these were Europeans, sort of lower class Europeans in English, and they basically sold themselves into indentured labor for passage for new opportunities in the New World, and the promise of freedom, which would eventually come in 7 to 10 years of servitude. When they arrived in Virginia, they were literally auctioned off, similar but not entirely like slaves, because there was an end. After 7 to 10 years, most indentured servants became free and were either given clothes and a bit of money. Now, what's important is this was seen as an alternative to slavery. We see a quicker move to slavery, as I said, in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, but the English preferred this to racial slavery, at least initially. A lot of the indentured servants that came from Britain's first colony, which was Ireland. A lot of the Irish, who lived very poor existence under sort of the yoke of British oppression, decided to try their luck in the New World and sold themselves into indentured servitude to start a new life. In 7 to 10 years, they would eventually become free. Now, part of the reason indentured servitude stops working is because think of it from the perspective of the landlord. If you are a landowner who has bought indentured servants and brought them to your plantation in Virginia, what happens once their contract runs out and you give them a bit of money? Well, you're basically financing your competition, right? A lot of these former indentured servants would move inland and start their own plantations. It was probably very small scale, but some of them became successful in establishing large plantations. So what happens first in 1620, but then by the end of the 17th century, by about 1680, 1690, and certainly by the early 18th century, what you get is the transition from a society that had slavery in the 1620s and the 1630s to a slave society by the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Now, if Portugal and Spain were the first imperial powers to use slaves, it is really the Dutch who perfected the transatlantic slave trade. If we move to the next slide, we can see this. So initially, slaves were supplied largely by the Portuguese, but as I mentioned earlier, the Portuguese Empire is essentially taken over by the Dutch Empire. And the Dutch really scaled up the slave trade from what the Portuguese were doing. The Dutch Empire in many ways was the most intensely commercial empire until the British Empire that comes a little bit later. And yet throughout most of its history, the Dutch Republic and its emerging empire was more like Venice and Florence, right? It's similar to Portugal, but if Portugal was Venice on a global scale, the Dutch take it to a much sort of larger scale at this point. It's a global scale, but it's much more intensely commercial. The Dutch Empire's initial success was the grain trade from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, picking off where the Hanseatic League had left off a few centuries earlier. From here, the Dutch followed in the footsteps of the Portuguese, completely supplanting them in the spice trade in the Asian and Indian Ocean world. The Dutch basically took over the Portuguese Empire in the East. Now, like the Portuguese did in the 16th century after Vasco da Gama and those that came after him entered the Indian Ocean, the Dutch did the same. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Dutch had taken over the spice trade. The Dutch Navy and merchant fleet and the Dutch East India Company, helped by its ability to raise capital and incur debt with the stock exchange in Amsterdam, became the dominant trading power in the Indian Ocean world. Now, two things came out of a conflict between the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish. For a while in the 17th century, the Spanish and the Portuguese crown was actually one, so it kind of existed as one country, and they were constantly fighting the Dutch. Partly because the Spanish crown was held by the Habsburgs, which at the time ruled over what was the sort of the low colonies. The Netherlands was actually a colony of Spain, but they revolted, and you got the Dutch Republic, which eventually grew into the Dutch Empire, which eventually took over the Portuguese Empire. So the Dutch take over the slave trade, and they form sort of the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch West Indian Company was set up specifically for the slave trade. It didn't really have any other function other than to provide slaves in 1640. And after the unsuccessful occupation of Pernambuco in Brazil, where they occupied it for a few years, but eventually the Portuguese were able to kick them out, they introduced sugar and slavery from the Caribbean. They basically took sugar from Brazil and moved into the Caribbean, where plantation slavery and the sort of plantation slavery complex reached its highest form of intensity and evolution. Sugar cultivation became far more successful in the Caribbean, as the readings point out, largely because of its proximity to Europe. It was much closer than Brazil. And as I said, they formed the West Indian Company, the Dutch West India Company, to trade almost exclusively in slaves. And now this would eventually be taken over by the British. And the British and the Dutch went to war in the sort of late 16th and early 17th centuries. And what sort of happened was a stalemate. And now what you get was in 1688, William of Orange, who was a Dutch nobleman, becomes King of England in the Glorious Revolution, something we'll talk about a few weeks later, probably in the second semester when we look at liberal democratic revolutions. And as a result of this, the British are able to take over not only the slave trade from the Dutch, but also they adopt Dutch finance, central banking, stock exchanges, all of these things. But they also perfect the plantation complex in the Caribbean. And what you get is the emergence of plantation slavery in the Caribbean, which is where it will sort of reach its zenith, much more so than in the American South, even though the American South would have 4 million slaves by 1860. So I'm going to leave it there until we get to the next slide and look at the emergence of plantation slavery in the Caribbean and the American South, and to a certain extent, Brazil.